everyone, I'm Jeremy Goodwin, Head of Pensions at Evershed Sutherland. Thanks for listening to Pensions in a Pod, a podcast where we take a look at the latest development of the pensions world. We want to try and share with you as our insights into what we believe really matters, what's really going on here legally. Now for something slightly different this time. I want to spend a little bit of time today looking at international issues. In particular, we have an excellent international pension practice, including a top-tier practice in Dublin. Today, the plan is to look at the new auto-enrolment laws being introduced in Ireland and look across at learnings in the UK on auto-enrolment as a comparison to what's intended for Ireland. So with this in mind, I'm delighted to be joined today by one of our partners in our Dublin office, David McKeating, and Louise McRae, a solicitor in our London office, who's been doing a lot of work around auto-enrolment issues. So, Tony, David, first of all, so what's planned for Irish auto-enrolment?
Thanks, Jeremy. So Ireland's new auto-enrolment regime is due to commence with effect from 1 January 2026. Now, this is a major development in the Irish pensions landscape. Ireland is the last OECD country to implement an auto-enrolment or equivalent regime to promote supplemental retirement savings. And auto-enrolment is something that has been under discussion for at least a decade. So it's a landmark moment, really, to be on the cusp of its rollout now in Ireland. So how will the new system work? Well, it's being implemented differently in Ireland when compared to the approach that was taken in the UK. We will have a single state-run scheme known as My Future Fund, which will be administered by a newly established body called the National Automatic Enrolment Retirement Savings Authority, or NERSA. Now, employers can operate their own qualifying pension scheme or qualifying PRSA outside of the auto-enrolment regime, and employees contributing to such an arrangement or having contributions paid on their behalf by their employer will be exempt from My Future Fund. But in order to be deemed a qualifying pension scheme or a qualifying PRSA, the arrangement will eventually need to meet certain minimum standards, which will include minimum contribution rates that will be set out in regulations by or before year 7 of the new system. But initially, any occupational pension scheme or PRSA will suffice. Under the auto-enrolment scheme, all employees aged between 23 and 60 who earn at least €20,000 per annum across all of their employers and who are not contributing to or having contributions paid by their employer on their behalf to a qualifying pension arrangement will be enrolled in My Future Fund automatically. Employees that are enrolled will be required to contribute to My Future Fund, as will their employer on their behalf, and they will also benefit from a state top-up contribution. The contribution rates will start low, with employees and their employers required to contribute 1.5% of the employee's gross income for the first 3 years, rising by a further 1.5% every 3 years, up to a total of 6% from year 10 onwards. The state top-up contribution will amount to a third of the employer and employee contributions, so starting at 0.5% in year 1 and rising to 2% by year 10. The state top-up contribution is provided in lieu of tax relief, and this is a fundamental difference when one compares the auto-enrolment system to an occupational pension scheme. Employee contributions are subject to an overall earnings cap of €80,000, with no contributions payable by either the employee or the employer above that cap. And employees who wish to opt out of My Future Fund may do so after being enrolled for 6 months, in which case they will have their contributions returned to them, but the contributions paid by their employers on their behalf will remain vested for their benefit and will not be refunded to the employer. And it's also worth noting, finally, that employees who do not otherwise meet the eligibility requirements, whether due to age or earnings, may elect to opt into My Future Fund, in which case they will be required to contribute and will benefit from employer contributions in the normal way.
Thanks, David. That's really good. So loads and loads and loads there, obviously, for us to be thinking about. Think about from a sort of society perspective. It's interesting that we look at Australia and where they've got to in relation to their contribution rates, and I guess in the UK, what we're trying to do, because I guess ultimately we want to try and think about the living wage and having a sort of a sensible retirement with enough money to actually live on in retirement. So, Louise, perhaps I can turn to you in terms of that journey that we've been through in the UK, trying to think about how through auto-enrolment we get the right amount of contributions being paid, really trying to think about what people's retirement then looks like, given this level of contribution that's going in. So, Louise, how are we seeing that pan out in the UK?
And thanks, Jeremy. And yeah, exactly that. So for context, at the minute in the UK, the total minimum contributions for both the employer and the employee is set at 8% of a job holder's qualifying earnings. So broadly, this is earnings between around £6,000 to £50,000 a year. And the contributions are commonly split as 5% from the employee and then 3% from the employer. But as we've touched on, this is different to Ireland, where eventually after 10 years, the minimum contribution level will be a total of 12% of earnings up to €80,000. And I think if we look at that in the context of the UK pensions landscape, at the moment there are calls that the current minimum level of contributions that we have need to be increased. And the Pensions Commission have even pointed out that it's expected that people who will be pensioners in 2050 are on track to be 8% poorer than today's pensioners. So I think there are a few important considerations if changes are going to be made. So first of all, looking at what the minimum amount should be. Some industry bodies say that this should be at least 12% from the first pound of earnings in order to get retirement savings to a sustainable level. Some are saying even higher. Second of all, it's thinking about what the split should be for the employer and the employee. So in the UK, the employee currently pays more, but in Ireland, this is split 50-50 between the employer and the employee. And another really important consideration, I think, is low earners. So if the minimum contributions are going to go up, this is going to have a disproportionately bigger strain for the lower earners compared to the higher earners. So it's thinking about whether or not there should be a lower percentage for these people. And another reason in favour of that is the state pension will also replace a larger proportion of the lower earners' salary. So there's also a case to say they don't necessarily need to save as much. And then there's also a worry that increasing it too high for lower earners might encourage people to opt out. So these are all really interesting things to consider, and all things that the Pensions Commission will be considering during phase 2 of the Pensions Commission review, because that focuses on pensions adequacy. And David, it'll be really good to get your views on whether you think the contributions level in Ireland have hit the right mark, or whether or not they haven't, and if you think, and also it'd be really interesting to know how Ireland actually settled on 12%.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and I think the whole point around adequacy is a really important one when you think about auto-enrolment. Now, I think you do have to bear in mind here that we are at the very beginning of our journey when it comes to auto-enrolment. So we've never had a mandatory pension system in Ireland before, and so this is an entirely new concept for both employees and employers alike. There was a lot of debate around what the right level at which to set contributions should be when the system was being developed in the first place. And particular concerns have been raised over the shock to employees in terms of the impact that contribution deductions would have on their take-home pay when they might not necessarily have ever been subject to contributions coming out of their pay packet for pension purposes. And also the cost to businesses, particularly smaller businesses, with the increase that mandatory employer pension contributions would have on payroll costs when, again, they were never required to make contributions before. And then added to that was also a desire to really encourage long-term participation by employees and to avoid a high opt-out rate from the system, particularly in the initial phase, which might be triggered by setting high contribution rates initially. So ultimately, the gradual phasing up of contributions over a decade was seen as a good way of balancing these concerns while also trying to give the system the best chance of success. That said, adequacy is clearly an issue, and I think particularly during the ramp-up phase. And one of the problems with the system in that regard is that My Future Fund is very inflexible when it comes to contribution rates. So the contributions rates are set and cannot be increased through voluntary contributions by an employee looking to supplement their retirement savings. And until the minimum standards for qualifying pension arrangements are set, making voluntary contributions to a pension arrangement outside of the auto-enrolment system will result in an employee becoming exempt from My Future Fund, and it would effectively remove them from the system. So having the opposite effect to what an employee might actually be trying to achieve. So there simply isn't a way, at least in the initial phase of the system's rollout, for an employee to really boost their pension savings. And that's another key difference between My Future Fund and an occupational pension scheme that I think both employers and employees should be aware of when considering the approach that they want to take to the new regime.
Thanks, David. It's interesting thinking about new sort of cost, if you like, for employers being brought in, particularly thinking about the UK in relation to some of the increased taxes we've seen for employers in the UK. You can see employers, with that increase you were talking about, Louise, in terms of potentially further costs coming through auto-enrolment, wanting to see how flexible this is in terms of these requirements, and if there's any ways in which particular provisions may not be enforced, etc. So, Louise, from your perspective, how's it been with that journey in the UK in terms of the enforcement of this auto-enrolment regime? And then, David, it'd be interesting to get your sense in terms of actually how the Irish regulator will be looking to enforce this.
So we have obviously the pensions regulator, and there's a lot that the regulator has done actually in terms of enforcing auto-enrolment breaches. So first of all, the regulator has a lot of powers to sanction employers. It can do this from issuing compliance and contribution notices on the one hand, to also issuing fixed and escalating penalty notices on the other hand. And I think it's safe to say the regulator isn't afraid to use these powers. So, for example, in the last regulator enforcement bulletin, this covered the period from July to December 2024, there were a total of 79,324 cases of enforcement activity relating to
huge.
employers, relating to employers who failed to comply with their auto-enrolment duties. So this just shows that even though auto-enrolment has been fully integrated in the UK for the last 7 years, the regulator is still taking a really firm stance to ensure that employers are compliant. And David, interested to hear from you on whether you think the Irish Pensions Authority are going to take a similar stance, or whether or not there'll be a bit of a grace period whilst auto-enrolment's actually introduced.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and it's very interesting hearing, in terms of the pension regulator and the approach that it's taking. I suppose in Ireland, the powers that are available are slightly softer, I suppose. There are broadly 2 enforcement powers that are provided for under the legislation, and these are compliance notices and fixed payment notices. Now, either of those notices may be served on an employer by an authorised officer, which will be a person appointed by NERSA with the consent of the Minister for Social Protection. And they can be served on an employer in 2 scenarios. So firstly, where the employer has failed to pay employer contributions or to remit employee contributions that are due to My Future Fund. And secondly, where the employer has been found guilty of hindering an employee from participating in My Future Fund. The Department of Social Protection has issued a number of press releases and updates recently warning employers that it is an offence to hinder or attempt to hinder an employee from accessing My Future Fund, and warning employers that any attempts to force an employee to join an occupational pension scheme will be investigated and may result in a sanction where the activity is deemed to amount to hindering access or an attempt to hinder access. So that's something that the department has already, before the system has even commenced, highlighted as a particular area of concern, and something that they will be monitoring on an ongoing basis. So I think you can expect to see quite a lot of activity in that area. And I would imagine that when the system goes live on 1 January, we will see initially quite high levels of enforcement in order to ensure compliance with the new regime. And the last thing to mention is there is also an ability for NERSA to publish the names of employers that have been sanctioned. So a name and shame concept in terms of trying to drive compliance going forward.
Can I just ask you, in terms of the industry as a whole, are you seeing employers, readily accepting this? So culturally, is this something which kind of the Irish clients and contacts you're talking to, are they kind of on board with this as a concept, or actually are people feeling annoyed about a further, in inverted commas, tax coming through on them?
Yeah, I think most employers do view this as a positive development, really. Now, there's obviously a number of different ways in which they can approach the new system, and I think for employers that's been a key issue, has been grappling with exactly what they want to do, and particularly given the fact that the 2 systems are so different around tax treatment and things like that. There's been a huge amount of work that have been done by employers trying to decide what's best for them and also for their employees. And obviously, to that point, there's a huge amount of work that goes into comparing the 2 systems, there's a huge amount of work that goes into comparing the 2 systems, whether it's the auto-enrolment regime and My Future Fund, or an employer's own occupational pension scheme, and what might be best for their employees, bearing in mind that it will be specific to an employee's particular circumstances.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. And I'm just trying to think more generally about what's going on in the UK. We've got through the pension schemes bill here in the UK. A lot more going on in terms of the decumulation, either retirement journey of all the employees who've got in DC arrangements. Again, trying to think about that in a wider sense. So we've got auto-enrolment obviously coming in with the terms you've talked about. So that's the accumulation stage. Thinking about people's retirement, are you expecting more to be flowing through on that, David?
Yeah, so we've already kind of started to see, I mean, there's very little in Ireland at the moment in terms of, kind of mandatory support or anything like that for savers in the decumulation phase. We are, we've recently had consultations published in respect of in-scheme drawdown. So there's a lot being done in that area, but we're very much still at the beginning of that journey. I think the focus at the moment obviously is on the auto-enrolment regime and getting that up and running, but we can expect to kind of move into more of that decumulation focus going forward.
Thanks, Ed. That's very interesting. And Louise, how are you seeing that by comparison to all the practice we're seeing develop through the UK?
There's lots going on at the minute, and I think there's been a big focus in the last couple of years, particularly now in the context of the pension schemes bill, to support savers not only through saving for their pension, but also now through their retirement decisions. So in the UK, after auto-enrolment reforms were phased in, we then had the freedom and choice changes, which meant that DC savers could access their entire pension pot in whatever way they wanted to, and without restrictions. So in theory, an individual could take out all of their money as cash, subject to just tax consequences, as soon as they reached age 55, which would increase the risk that they might run out of money later on in retirement. And individuals, they also have complex decisions to make in retirement about how to use their money. And also they can't just be left to their own devices to make judgments about what are the most suitable choices for them. And the dial is definitely shifting now. And the pension schemes bill has really put a spotlight on supporting individuals through their retirement journey. And guided retirement is central to this. So that is essentially where schemes will be required to offer a default retirement income solution to members. So that will be designed to give members a regular income on retirement, but also take into account the needs, interests and circumstances of members. And linked to that, we've also got the advice guidance boundary review, and that is where the FCA and the Treasury are working alongside one another to try and address the gap between providing information and guidance on the one hand and financial advice on the other hand. So it's ultimately going to provide something that we're going to call targeted support. So again, it's all about supporting individuals through that retirement process. So lots of changes in the pipeline on the decumulation phase in the UK.
Louise, thank you. What a fascinating time to be in pension say. There's so much going on at the moment. So it's really interesting to see in terms of from an Irish perspective, that sense on auto-enrolment starting lower but becoming higher with greater contributions going in than what we're seeing in the UK. And obviously we've just got the Pensions Commission 2 coming through. So it'll be interesting to see to what extent they look across pond to Ireland and say, actually, should we be doing more to try and replicate where the contributions will ultimately end up in Ireland? We'll see, obviously, and it's similarly in relation to that decumulation journey, where it sounds like we're a little bit further ahead in the UK compared to Ireland. Again, what may flow through in relation to that? So there's plenty out there for us all to be thinking about and talking through. But it's great to see when you take from a macro perspective in relation to it, the thinking and the policy advancement which is going on at the moment. Very, very interesting times at the moment. So it's been fun today. It's been good to see the international comparison in relation to one of the key provisions, obviously, we've seen for many years in the UK through auto-enrolment. It's been enjoyable. Any sort of thoughts and comments, please do let us know. But apart from that, we hope you'll dial in very soon for the next Pensions in a Pod. Thanks all for listening to this latest Pensions in a Pod episode. To access previous episodes, please have a look at our website, on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, where you can find them all stored for your enjoyment. We look forward to coming back to you in a month's time to give you the latest insight on what's really going on in the legal pensions landscape.